Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. The cases of black men and boys killed by police officers continue to pile up. No indictment was returned against the officer who shot and killed Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and mass protests have been carried out from coast to coast. But it's not just the Michael Brown case. A 12-year-old boy with a toy gun was shot and killed by a cop in Cleveland. Here in New York, Eric Garner, a middle-aged man accused of selling loose cigarettes, was killed by a police officer who held him in an outlawed chokehold even after Mr. Garner protested again and again that he couldn't breathe. Why do these tragic killings continue year after year? What can we do about them? How can those of us who are truly concerned help bring them to an end? I'll ask these questions of my guest, Norman Siegel, a civil rights lawyer who once headed the New York Civil Liberties Union and who has some very definite ideas about how to improve relations between the police and the communities they serve. Norman, welcome. Thanks for coming in. I appreciate it.
Pleasure to be here.
All right, so the Michael Brown case in Ferguson, Missouri. It's gotten all kinds of media coverage. There have been protests, et cetera. What do we know factually about what happened in that case?
Well, one of the problems is because the prosecutor chose to go to the grand jury, it was a secret proceeding. And although correctly, in my opinion, he released the transcripts and some of the evidence, we still don't know all the details, and that's part of the confusion and even the resentment that we've seen over the last week with people protesting all across this country. But what we do know is that there was an incident where Michael Brown was interacting with the police officer, Mr. Wilson, and two shots came out of Officer Wilson's gun. Allegedly, Michael Brown punched him in the face. One of the bullets hit Mr. Brown in his thumb. Then what we're told is Mr. Brown begins to run away from Officer Wilson. Officer Wilson gets out of his car, starts to follow him, and for some reason, depending on which testimony, some people testify before the grand jury that Brown turns around and starts coming towards Wilson. How far he got, I don't know at this point. And then we do know that 10 shots were fired, and some of them hit Mr. Brown, and Mr. Brown died. That's what we know, but we don't know it all. And one of my criticisms is that when you go to a secret proceeding, the nature of the secrecy will only breed distrust and mistrust, which happened here and has happened before, time and time again.
So we'll explore these proceedings in a moment, but you felt or have felt that the officer, Darren Wilson, had some alternatives to the way he behaved. Talk about what he might have done.
Well, absolutely. There were options. To begin with, in my opinion, there's a legacy of machismo, of brutality in law enforcement. So, assuming Michael Brown punched him in the face, he's got to defend his manhood. Nonsense. There's lots of ways. Michael Brown, who allegedly was 6'6", 292 pounds in Ferguson, they probably knew who he is and where they could have found him a few hours later. So the officer didn't have to go after him. He could have let him run away and picked him up later, come with a few other officers and talk him down at that moment. Second, even if he's following him, we now have in law enforcement taser guns. You could have used a taser gun. You could have done other things than run after him with your gun drawn. Once you draw your gun and you're running in a street after someone has hit you, there is a risk that you're going to consciously or unconsciously use your firearm with the result that the person could die. And there is an element of what's called criminal negligent homicide when you fail to perceive the risk in a negligent way, and the result is that another person dies. That could be criminal negligent homicide. The manslaughter and murder charges is when there's intent. And I'm not sure we could argue at this point that that officer had the intent to kill Michael Brown. But running through the street with your gun drawn after that kind of altercation, maybe you negligently failed to perceive the risk, and as a result, Michael Brown's dead.
If we look at the proceedings themselves, let's find out where things went wrong there, because I don't think there are many people who are satisfied with how these events unfolded. In the first place, if you look at the prosecutor, Robert McCulloch, should he have been removed from the case in favor of a special prosecutor in any event, just to start with?
Yes, because what happens in these situations, and it's been proven time and time again, that the prosecutor relies on the police officers for the overwhelming percentage of his cases to make the criminal case. And so the prosecutor becomes part of the family of the law enforcement community because he's relying on them hour to hour in his job. And so there's a built-in conflict of interest, in my opinion. And therefore, that prosecutor should not be prosecuting cases where the officer is alleged to have violated the citizen's rights. We should have all across this country, in each state and on the federal level, an office of a special prosecutor for police misconduct cases. And therefore, McCulloch should have stepped aside, and even if he felt that he could do the job, there was the appearance of a conflict of interest at a minimum. And once you start in that direction, and then you add to it a secret grand jury proceeding, it's a recipe for resentment.
What is an alternative to secret grand jury proceedings or to grand jury proceedings in general? What options do we have?
We have the option of a preliminary hearing, which is open. The public can see it. It's an adversarial proceeding. The prosecutor would be representing the people. The lawyer, in this case for Wilson, would be representing Wilson. There'd be a judge, and you would be able to see all the proceedings. You would hear the testimony of the witnesses. You would see the cross-examination. Was it thorough? Was it complete? Was it one-sided, as we believe, hearing what happened in the grand jury here, that they were only questioning vigorously Michael Brown's witnesses as opposed to Officer Wilson's? It seems to me, as a result of Ferguson, that the result should not be just that police wear cameras, because I have lots of questions about that with regard to surveillance and privacy violations. We have to do systemic change. We have to create the offices of special prosecutors in these cases. We need to give serious consideration to not going to a grand jury and going to a preliminary hearing. We need to take into consideration the fact that 55 police officers in a town that's 2/3 African American and only 2 African American officers, there's something wrong with that ratio. So we have to have affirmative action. I know people don't like that word. I still like that word. We have to change the diversity of police departments across this country. So there are serious systemic problems with police-community relations. And what troubles me, especially with Obama's summit at the White House, at best, it's a modest approach. We have to be bold. We have to confront these systemic problems because it's gone on for too long.
If you move to a preliminary hearing, the preliminary hearing is conducted in front of whom?
A judge.
And what happens at the end of the preliminary hearing?
Well, the standard, and a lot of people don't understand this, I think the prosecutor in Ferguson muddied the waters. The standard for an indictment, which would be at the preliminary hearing, same thing in a grand jury, is probable cause. It's not guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And so the evidence comes in, and if you objectively, reasonably believe that a crime was committed, you then indict the particular person, in this case an officer. The presumption of innocence continues, but he goes to trial, in an open trial, gets his day in court, and then the standard is a higher standard beyond a reasonable doubt. I think there was enough evidence from what I've read, although I have to be careful because I wasn't in that room, but from what I read, I think there was enough evidence to have probable cause, a reasonable objective belief that a crime was committed, in this case, perhaps criminal negligent homicide, and let it go to trial. When you stymie that process, you see the kind of reaction we have. And finally, I want to make my final point. I do not accept any violence. And the people who engaged in that violence in Ferguson, we should make it absolutely clear, they should be prosecuted because they broke the law. And although I'm for civil rights, I'm for civil rights across the board. And the peoples whose businesses were destroyed, their rights were violated as well.
Going back to the preliminary hearing, though, the judge would determine whether an indictment would be returned?
Whether or not there was probable cause for an indictment to be returned, and then you would have a trial.
If this is in public, would you be concerned about the idea of information being revealed at a preliminary hearing, which would not have the same rules of procedure as a trial? Would you be concerned about embarrassing or other kinds of information that you'd like to keep personal emerging at this public hearing that had nothing to do with whether or not an individual had committed a crime?
I'm not too concerned about that, because if you had a qualified jurist, the judge making those decisions, if someone is trying to elicit testimony from a witness which was irrelevant and immaterial to the proceeding, the judge would prohibit that. Second, in the adversarial system, which is a hallmark of American jurisprudence, is that if the prosecutor was trying to do something that was irrelevant and immaterial, the defense lawyer would object, and vice versa. If the defense lawyer was doing something, the prosecutor would object. So I think there's enough checks and balances built in. When you compare the preliminary hearing process to the behind-the-scenes, non-adversarial grand jury, it's to me a no-brainer. What's also interesting, in Missouri, I found out last week that in fact the preliminary hearing option is legal. So why did the special prosecutor choose to go to the secret non-adversarial proceeding, grand jury, rather than the open process? I think that question raises lots of serious problems.
And then let's go back for one more question about the way a police officer might react if he's attacked by someone. So if an individual punched a police officer or otherwise attacked a police officer, the police officer, I mean, other than engaging in a fight, and the other person turns to run away, the police officer has very few options here other than to let the person go. I'm pretty sure from covering cops over a long period of time that there's not a lot of cops that would go along with that idea. What would your response to them be? They would say, well, I'm not a punching bag. You can't just let people punch me and run away. What would you say to them?
Well, you're not just a punching bag. Eventually, if you're smart, you're going to prosecute this individual. You'll testify against him, and you'll hold him accountable. He might have to go to jail. And I think that there are other ways to deal with violence other than be violent yourself. I think it goes to the training. We have to undo the stereotypes. There's one other aspect to this, and unfortunately a lot of people don't want to talk about it, and then some people who talk about it oversimplify it. As I talked before, there's a legacy of brutality in police departments, and when I say that, that doesn't indict all cops. It just means that there's too many cops, a small minority, that create bad history for law enforcement. Similarly, there's a legacy of racism. In my opinion, based on my example in New York City and other areas that I've been involved, the darker the skin of the individual, the more likely his rights or her rights are going to be violated. And we've not really dealt with that. We have to undo the stereotypes. I've heard twice in my career cops say, I got to go to the zoo to deal with the animals. On the other hand, in demonstrations where I've been the lawyer, I hear demonstrators say, off the pigs. It's interesting that both sides use animal terms to describe each other. I think there has to be, in the precincts and in the police academy, training to undo the stereotypes so that the officer's out on the street and he sees people out on the street in a protest or coming at them. The stereotypes, whether conscious or unconscious, have to be undone. And until we do that, we're going to see, unfortunately, more situations where we'll all kind of say, why did this have to happen?
We've, as I mentioned at the top of the show, there have been so many examples, many recent examples of people being killed by the police for no good apparent reason. The 12-year-old boy in Cleveland who had a toy gun, there was a video of that. He was not threatening anyone.
Sorry, he was all by himself.
Police car pulled up, and within 2 seconds they had shot this youngster and killed him. Then here in New York, there was the case in the housing project in Brooklyn where the police officer went into a darkened stairwell, pulled his gun. He said that the gun went off accidentally, but that accidental bullet happened to catch a black man who was walking down the street, walking down the stairs with a woman, and killed him. And then there's the Eric Garner case in Staten Island, and the cases go to the chokehold, which has been outlawed by the police department. The thing that really struck me there was, again, a video. He was not resisting arrest, but also after he was down and you know, complaining that he couldn't breathe, and they still didn't release it. I mean, it seemed so outrageous.
In New York, we have Amadou Diallo, Patrick Dorismond, Timothy Sansbury, Osman Zongo, Sean Bell. You know, the list goes on, so that
Eleanor Bumpers in her apartment
in the Bronx.
Yeah.
So people should stop and then see the pattern, and then have to confront what appears to be a pattern, and then begin to try to overcome it. And too often, the elected officials either engage in rhetoric or they disappear. And we have a lack of leadership across the board. In Washington, they have a conference, and the most that they're going to do is suggest cameras and perhaps that officers shouldn't have military gear. You've got to have a much more vigorous program to deal with this systemic problem. Otherwise, it's going to rear its ugly head again and again.
Is it just, it has to be more than just stereotypes, though. I mean, in some cases, we've had children blown away, not even with toy guns. We've had situations going back several years in New York where a 10-year-old youngster and a 15-year-old youngster were just blown away on the street by a cop for no reason at all. And then Eleanor Bumpers was an emotionally disturbed woman who was inside her apartment. There must be something other than just stereotypes that's going on, and in almost all of these cases, not everyone, but in most of these cases, these are African Americans. Why is that?
Well, you know, Mayor Giuliani had a task force after a situation in Brooklyn, and when I went to the academy and looked at their curriculum and looked at the kinds of instances officers had to deal with, they were initially psyched exam when they came in. But this is a really hard, negative job. Most of the cops do a really good job, but there's a small minority. We should randomly have people come in for psych exams with due process, because a guy could come in and then 7 years later, being out on the street, seeing all the negatives, he's ready to blow himself, you know, in the sense of all the stress that he has. We should be able to institute this kind of random psych exams with due process, of course, and maybe be able to predict the people who could explode out on the street. I think that we've had for too long the pattern which seems to be disproportionately about young men of color. And I think there has to be some better training and better understanding of what's in the psyche of officers when they see certain people. Amadou Diallo. I live on the west side of Manhattan. On West 71st, there are brownstones. If someone was white doing exactly what Amadou Diallo was doing in Soundville of the Bronx, those 4 officers would have talked him down. They wouldn't have come out pulling a gun because, quote, the neighborhood and the individual fit into a stereotype or a pattern that they thought that they had to approach him with the gun. I think that that kind of discussion, that kind of programming is so crucial, and yet we don't see it.
You've mentioned several things that you'd like to see done, but let's try and pull it together a little bit. The goal is to establish better police-community relations in general, not just in these terribly tragic situations. But we don't want these tragedies to occur either. Where would you start? What are some of the most important things that you think we need to be doing in our cities across America?
We should not give up and stereotype the cops. We should have training at the academy and in the precincts to undo the stereotypes and begin to have people from the community in those training programs so the police officers get to know the people in the neighborhood and aren't afraid of them. Similarly, people in the neighborhood should get to understand who the police are and why they're there. A lot of the cops are there to try to help people. So The gap is huge. A bridge has to be built. You need political leadership to make that happen. I don't see it happening. I'd start there. And second, the systemic changes. Office of a Special Prosecutor, consideration of going to preliminary hearings, and civilian oversight over the police departments. Those are the kind of things that I would do, and I would do it quickly, but I've been advocating this for years. I don't see the political leadership in New York. I don't see it on the national level, and that's the most distressing thing. As I get older, I think some of these issues are easy. There's no Dr. Martin Luther King around. There's no even Andy Young around. There's no Ralph Abernathy around. And the leaders that we have, even in the civil rights community, you know, they do mumble-jumble rhetoric. We need thoughtful people who will address these issues in a balanced but yet principled manner. I don't see that on the landscape now.
Now, these criminal justice issues we're talking about are a reflection of what's going on in the wider society. So when we have situations like Ferguson, other racially charged incidents, the polls show that there's a distinct breakdown, differences of opinion between African Americans and white Americans. How are we doing in terms of race relations in this country? Obama gets elected president in 2008, and we're told that we're in this post-racial era. Apparently not. But what's your take on the state of race relations in America right now?
We're in a mess. There's very little leadership. I also stopped, and I tell my white friends, stop going up to Harlem and Bed-Stuy to talk to the black community. We have to go into the white community and talk to the white community about some of these issues. We also can go into the black and Latino and Asian community. But I do think that we should not write off the Caucasian community. I think there were really good people. I saw when I went south, whites there begin to change their attitudes on race issues. In some ways, I know this always gets me in trouble, in some ways, the race relations in places like Alabama and Georgia today are in some ways better than they are in New York, because here the racism is subtle and sophisticated, but it sure still does hurt. In the South, at least people, in retrospect, were honest about their racism. I think that one of the problems about race in America, and especially in up-South cities like New York, Chicago, Boston, we don't talk honestly about race. People are always shocked when I say, look, I am not colorblind. When I'm talking to Bob Herbert, I see an African-American man. The question is, do I treat you the same way I would treat a white guy or an Asian guy? And if the answer is no, you got a problem with your prejudice, and you've got to deal with it. We don't deal with it. We either are afraid to talk openly about it, or there's no programs, there's no leadership, and that's why we're in a mess. In some ways, I would be hopeful that there's people out there who understand this and are ready to provide the necessary leadership. But other than someone like you, who I know and respect, there aren't many people. We can have this discussion here today, and I think that hopefully people will listen. But most people can't have this conversation across race lines because they're afraid to open up, because when they open up, they're going to realize consciously or unconsciously they have prejudice in their mind.
We're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. Norman, thank you so much for this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Bob.
We'll be back in a moment with a final word. On December 1st, 2009, President Obama announced in a speech at West Point that he was escalating U.S. involvement in the war in Afghanistan, which at that time was already 8 years old. He would send in an additional 30,000 U.S. troops, he said. But he almost immediately added that in another 18 months, he would begin winding down our involvement in the war. 9 days after that, he received the Nobel Peace Prize. Today, 13 long years after September 11, 2001, we're still in Afghanistan. American service members are still dying. But even after all these years, we're still not winning the war. Recent news stories told us the Taliban was still fighting furiously and effectively and had overrun yet another Afghan army base. Meanwhile, we are redeploying thousands of American troops to that never-ending war in Iraq, nearly a dozen years after the shock and awe bombing campaign of March 2003. Bush administration officials thought the war in Iraq would last a few months at best, and maybe just a few weeks. Now it seems as though it may go on forever. Nearly 7,000 U.S. servicemen and women have died in those two wars, and trillions of taxpayer dollars are being spent. For what? If anyone has a good explanation for why we're still fighting in those two countries, I wish they would tell me. If you're going to fight a war, you should do everything you can to win it. If you're not willing to win a war, you shouldn't fight it. That's all for now. See you next time.